Welcome to Forum 360, a global outlook with a local view. I'm your host, Pat Simons. To find out more about us, go to forum360.org. 2020 is a time to commemorate and celebrate the 19th Amendment, 100 years of women winning the right to vote. Before 1920, women did not have full voting rights as United States citizens. My grandmothers were born into a time when they were not guaranteed a voting franchise. The best case scenarios were for small populations of women who were granted very limited and tightly controlled voting rights depending on where they lived. Most did not have rights at all. What the 19th Amendment did was to simplify matters by giving voting rights to all women, no matter what state they lived in. The 19th Amendment states, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation," unquote. In 1920, over 8 million women across the country voted in the general election. I am delighted to have Iris Meltzer, president of the League of Women Voters Ohio, who just happened to be celebrating your 100th anniversary on Valentine's Day,
That's
February
correct.
14th. And welcome to Elisabeth Smith-Pryor, Associate Professor of History at Kent State University. I want to thank you both for coming on today. I think this will be a very interesting discussion. And if I may, I'm going to refer to you as Iris and to you as Liz.
That's great.
Lots of interesting information to cover, so I'm going to kick right off, Liz, with a question to you. Now, the 1800s saw reform movements emerging in the United States. What factors affected women, the
Sure.
reform factors, and did they intersect?
That's a really great question. Particularly at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, again, as the real push for women getting the right to vote really takes off, a lot of changes going on. There's a lot of upheaval in terms of rapid industrialization, more people going to work in factories. There's a big migration, people moving from rural areas to urban areas. There's just a lot of change going on. There's a great deal of wealth inequality. The 1890s are the so-called Gilded Age of America. And so there are a number of people, including many women, who become very involved in reform efforts, engaging in things like creating settlement houses to help assimilate newcomers to the city. Engaging in all kinds of progressive reform efforts to get better food and health, to get better working conditions for people. So it's a moment of an incredible efforts to make change.
Well, that's it sounds like a perfect time for this to be happening. Now, social and legal reforms were happening internationally as well, paralleling the United States. Can you talk a little bit about what was happening in the world?
Sure. This is definitely, as I mentioned, the turn of the last century, and particularly the first and second decades of the 20th century. When you think about women's movement here in the United States, it's a moment where it's a mass movement, but it's an international movement too. Women in the United Kingdom are agitating for the vote. Women throughout Europe are working for the vote. Women are also becoming involved in a variety of other kinds of reform efforts, including peace efforts and things like that, that again, they are making international links.
Iris, what is the significance of the July 1848 Seneca Falls Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York? And who were the perpetrators of that convention?
The perpetrators. Well, its significance is that it has been identified as the official start of the women's rights movement. It may not have been, but it's certainly been designated as such. And it was a gathering of around 300 people, men and women, in Seneca Falls over a couple of days to create what they called the and I'm blanking on it.
Are you speaking about the Declaration?
The Declaration of Sentiments. and was signed by most, though not all, of the participants there. It was a meeting called by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who had met in England a number of years before and had attended, though not been allowed to participate, in a anti-slavery convention. And they theoretically at that point said, we need to come back to the US and have a meeting on women's right to vote. So Stanton, Frederick Douglass, Lucretia Mott are some of the big names that are associated with that particular council meeting.
And I found it interesting because I looked up the Declaration of Sentiment and I thought it parallels our Declaration of Independence. It's a fascinating document to read. Liz, speaking in a historical context, Frederick Douglass, as Iris mentioned, who was an escaped slave, he was self-educated reformer, dedicated his life to equality issues, but he was also a great friend of the women's suffrage movement.
That's right.
And he was present, as you said, at the Seneca Falls Convention. Why did the 1870 ratification of the 15th Amendment become a bone of contention between Douglass and the women's suffrage movement?
That's a great question. Again, part of what happened early on is the anti-slavery movement and the women's rights movement are closely connected, which is why Frederick Douglass is involved. And in fact, he's one of the people in the Seneca Falls who actually is one of the few men who's like, yes, women should have the right to vote. But we do end up having a civil war. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, the question comes up about how are we going to address the end of slavery? And Congress decides to create amendments to the Constitution. And there are two that are really key here. The 14th Amendment, which now provides for citizenship based on being born in the United States, but it also adds the word male to the Constitution in a section dealing with the issue of voting. And that becomes a bit of a spark that begins to pull apart the original kind of alliance between anti-slavery activists and women's rights activists. And then the 15th Amendment, which is the amendment which provided for African-American, particularly African-American men to vote. And that led to a very ugly split in the women's rights movement, where people like Frederick Douglass, looking at what was happening after the Civil War and what was happening to Black communities in the South, essentially argued that it was important to get the vote for Black men. And women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued that it was women's time too. And so in many ways it was a pragmatic decision on both parts to not really support each other anymore and kind of split over the 15th Amendment.
Must have been very frustrating because between 1870 and 1920, women waited another 50 years to get the vote. Seems like a long time to be patient.
Right.
I'm not sure they were.
No,
right.
no, they were active. They were very active anyway.
And I believe that in his heart, Frederick Douglass never stopped.
No, he continued to support.
the
He just
suffrage.
decided that it was very important for the African American community who was facing terrorism and other kinds of acts like that in the South for Black men to have access to the vote first. But he continued to support. He actually called for he and others called for a 16th Amendment to the Constitution after the 15th that would have brought about women having the right to vote. But of course, that didn't happen.
Well, those are little bits of history we may lose. I'm glad you're bringing that up. Iris, in terms of other prominent suffragists, would you like to name some other women, particularly women of color?
Sure. Women of color in the suffrage movement include notably Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist whose passion and focus was on ending the murders of African American citizens in this country. And let's see, Mary Church Terrell, I believe Frances Harper, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, were all women of color who were active at various times or consistently across the women's rights movement.
And I believe the Sojourner Truth is a connection to Akron, right?
Yes.
So it brings
Yes.
it even closer to home.
Yes, it
right.
does. It does.
What do you think were the greatest challenges for women in the suffrage movement?
Well, certainly other women
That's true.
who felt that their place on a pedestal was going to be harmed by women entering the political sphere. Men who, again, saw women as in need of their protection. And I'm not sure it was articulated as being anti-woman so much as it was being pro a certain kind of woman, a certain vision of womanhood, which did not include women having rights. So I think those were probably the church was very against. Not all churches, certainly the Quakers were very supportive of women and women's suffrage, but in general there was a view of where is woman's place, and it is not in the voting booth.
I heard comments that there were really people convinced that women did not have the intellectual
Yes, sure.
capability
Yep.
Right.
of making those important decisions.
That's correct.
Right.
They should leave those decisions to their
Yes.
husbands, to their fathers.
And I was also thinking, just logistically speaking, I mean, no internet, no smartphones,
Right.
horses, telegraphs,
Right.
trains. I mean, it was pretty amazing what they were able to do on their home front. Let me see, I have another question. Iris, there's evidence that there is discrimination and bigotry in the early days of the movement, and that League of Women Voters also was tainted by that
Absolutely.
at some point. And I wondered why you think that happened and what is being done today to correct those wrongs.
Well, I think it happened because society as a whole marginalized all people of color, women and men. And the women who came together and formed the League of Women Voters just prior to passage of the 19th Amendment viewed themselves as very special, as they had won the right for women to vote, and that they were by and large middle class, upper middle class women who also, I think, didn't even see that there were other women. So women who worked outside the home, you know, they barely addressed that, and really viewed themselves as part of the women's club movement. So weren't attentive to those, and saw themselves as leaders. We are the justifiable leaders of this movement, just as they view the right to vote as something for educated American-born women.
Well, if you're just now joining us, this is Forum 360, and I'm your host, Pat Simons. Today, my guests are Elisabeth Smith-Pryor, history professor from Kent State University, and League of Women Voters of Ohio president, Iris Meltzer, and we're talking about the 100 years of women winning the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. What is League doing today about those past?
Well, one of the things we're doing is admitting it, and not burying that poor history on our part. So lots of recognition, lots of soul searching. In the last 2 to 4 years at the League of Women Voters US level, and then trickling down or cascading down to the states, a big emphasis on diversity and developing diversity plans, diversity initiatives, and making that a key part of who we are as a movement. I will add that it is to our detriment or shame that in our 100 years we've only had one black president of the League of Women Voters. And it is my fervent hope that that changes.
Sounds like you're starting a healing process.
Well, we are trying to heal.
Now, even though voting rights amendments have been ratified, multiples over time, there are still underserved populations and populations whose voting rights are challenged. Voter suppression is an ongoing concern. for populations. What is being done to protect voter rights today?
You probably know better than I do. I mean, I know there are different groups and organizations in different states that are working for that. Probably the best known at the moment is taking place in Georgia, where Stacey Abrams, who had run for governor in 2018 but lost, and was concerned about there being voter suppression in Georgia, has created a group, I believe it's called Fair Fight, was created both to address issues related to attempts to suppress the vote in Georgia and nationally. So looking at things like voter ID, laws, purging registration. So that's certainly one group that's out there, and I'm sure there are many others.
The league, at least in Ohio, has a hotline the day of elections that individuals can call and say they're having trouble voting or there's an issue, and the league tries to respond to that in real time. There's an organization called All Voting is Local, which is looking at people's access to polls, whether or not there are sufficient poll workers available. Are the machines, are there sufficient machines? If it's paper ballots, are there enough paper ballots? What are the backup plans? So the last election, a couple of voting places in Portage County lost power.
Oh boy.
It certainly was an act of nature. This wasn't on purpose, but there were plans in place by the Portage County Board of Elections to respond to that immediately. And so there's a lot of oversight and planning and saying what if, as well as response, people ready to respond should there be a problem.
Well, and I know that League's very big on voter registration.
Yes.
And League has been a real proponent of going after the purge in Ohio.
Absolutely.
I know that that's been challenged by League and
Yes.
has been proven that the system was flawed.
Yes.
So there has been some important work and continues to be important work. Now, the 100 years of the 19th Amendment, I believe, is officially on August 26, 2020. It's also called Equality Day. Are you aware of particular events that are planned to commemorate that day this year?
Pretty much that's being left to local leagues as they have a sense of what their community responds to best. State leagues are also making materials available, making website specific to events that are upcoming, and giving people the tools so that they can celebrate as their league.
Now, the
Determines
Ohio
best.
Humanities has also been involved at the state level,
Yes.
haven't they? They've been promoting materials as well on the 19th.
Yes, the League of Women Voters Ohio was able to secure a grant from the Ohio Humanities Council, which developed the reading list and study guide on materials related to women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment, as well as contracting with two scholars who have been presenting around the state on women's suffrage.
Now, to get that material and get that reading list and resource list, they can go to my.lwv.org/Ohio, and they
Yes.
can get that material.
Yes.
I believe last year the Akron Rubber Ducks, hosted women's
great.
organizations
Yes, they did.
for Equality Day. Is that going to happen
I
again
believe
this year?
it is.
I think we should stand by and come to the ballpark
Yes.
and watch the marching and the singing and all the wonderful things that happen. I also know that voter registration was set up at the event, and that there were all kinds of voter updating information that was available. What are some historical places that the public can visit to get a personal sense of the history?
I think you should do a road trip. That's what you need to do, is do a road trip, right? You need to go to the National Park Services has, in Seneca Falls. You can go visit that. You can go to Rochester, where Frederick Douglass lived for a long time, but so did
Rochester, New York.
Rochester, New York. Sorry, yes, Rochester,
Okay.
New York. And Frederick Douglass lived there, and as did Susan B. Anthony. Closer to home, take a drive over to Salem, Ohio, which had one of the very early women's conventions. In fact, it was all women. It was women-led. In Salem, there's no place I think to visit, but there are historic markers there. Again, we mentioned Akron, which is where the black advocate Sojourner Truth gave her famous "Aren't I a Woman" speech. The old stone church is long gone, but there is a historic plaque there too.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned something happened in Ravenna, Ohio as well?
That's
Yes.
right.
There's no markers for it, but it brings it home and brings
That's
it
right,
closer
right.
to our understanding. And
Right.
and I also know that the Harriet Upton Taylor House is open for tour in Warren, Ohio, and she was very prominent in the movement. So that's another close to home place to
Yes.
go. But I think the national parks is a great place to go,
Right.
and Google about these places. Now, League formed officially 6 months prior to the national, or pardon me, to the 19th Amendment.
Correct.
The founder was Carrie
Chapman
Chapman
Catt.
Catt. Okay. So it appears that leagues at all levels are doing their own celebrations. And you've described what League Ohio's doing. You have a national convention in Washington,
We
D.C.
do.
in June.
We do. Latter part of June, League members from across the country will be gathering in Washington for our convention, which happens every other year in even years.
So there'll be 100 for the 19th and
Yep.
100 for League. And we're in a presidential election year. So it'll be a very interesting
Yes.
convention.
Yes.
Who can join League?
Anybody who is a citizen, age 16 or over.
And I believe there are special compensations made for students.
Yes. At the national level, the decision was made that the student per member payment, which is how we pay our dues, would be $5 for students.
And I suppose it's important to mention that League is nonpartisan,
Correct.
nonprofit,
But very political.
very political, very active on issues and things, never on candidates.
Correct.
But to understand that you really run the organization at all levels on a shoestring.
Absolutely.
Lots of volunteer effort being put into making all of this happen.
Yes.
And I'm impressed with the number of men who have started to join League. Apparently you can't change the title,
Right.
the name of the organization. Liz, we want to talk about a few books that you think would be complementary.
Yeah, there is a wonderful new book all about women's struggle for the right to vote, basically going from the 19th century through finally achieving the 19th Amendment by a historian named Susan Ware. I have to admit, I'm terrible at titles. So hopefully the information will be up on your site.
Yes.
Oh, you may have the title
Why
in front
they
of you.
marched.
Why they
Untold
marched.
Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote.
And it's a wonderful book. It's a great read. Fun, fascinating stories about some really incredible women from all walks of life. There's a great book called The Grounding of Modern Feminism by a historian named Nancy Cott, which really takes you into that moment in the 1910s where the struggle for the right to vote in the United States becomes a mass movement, and then what happens afterwards. So the creation of things like the League of Women Voters, the push for an Equal Rights Amendment, those kinds of things. And then finally, if you're interested in knowing more particularly about the role of African American women in the suffrage movement, 19th century through the early 20th century, there's a really important book by a historian named Rosalind Terborg Penn on Black women and the suffrage movement.
It's an interesting span of time because that's when the 18th Amendment was adopted in 1850. Is that correct?
Which amendment?
The 15th Amendment?
Oh, the 15th, yes, in 1870.
And in
yeah.
that same time span,
Yes.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yes, to actually look at, as Iris was saying, a lot of the women, white women who are involved tend to be women who come from a certain amount of money, a certain amount of status in order to be able to spend the time to be activists. So we've lost a lot of information on black women who tended to not come from those sorts of backgrounds. And this book does a really great job of trying to recover as much as possible the lives of black women who were involved in the struggle for the right to vote.
Well, great recommendations from both of these sources. I appreciate that. It's been fascinating to talk about this. There'll be resources that we've offered the public, and they can continue to be curious and visit the sites and read materials. And go to the league website, right? And see those materials firsthand and see what your local league's doing and join in.
Sounds good.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I thank you both for coming.
You're quite welcome.
It's been a pleasure to host Ohio League of Women Voters President Iris Meltzer and Elisabeth Smith-Pryor, Associate Professor of History at Kent State University. We thank them for a quick jog down memory lane of voting rights for women. Best wishes to League of Women Voters on their 100th anniversary. And let's commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment as a time of remembrance, reflection, and celebration. The voting franchise is our power to determine leadership, not to be taken for granted. Even today, incessant and sometimes insidious efforts to chip away at our voting rights is occurring. It is important to shine the light on voter suppression. Nevertheless, she persisted. This is Pat Simons for Forum 360. Thank you for joining me, and have a great day.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.